Welcome to the Space Marketing Podcast, where we look at marketing principles, strategies, and tactics through the lens of space. Hi, I am your host, Izzy House, and I am so excited to share this journey with you as we explore the different space industries. On this episode, we will look at space policy with Steve Wolfe, President and co-founder of Beyond Earth Institute. So lift off in 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Space Marketing Podcast. Information relating to our discussion today and links to the video version can be found in the episode show notes on spacemarketingpodcast.com. Please like and subscribe to the podcast. It will help more people reach beyond the atmosphere. Information in this episode is for entertainment and information only. Please consult a professional for your specific situation. In this episode, we look at what one company is doing to prepare for humans living and working off-planet now and in the future. The Beyond Earth Institute is a non-profit think tank that, along with the stakeholder community, conducts research, provides analysis, makes recommendations, and develops vital insights regarding space policy proposal with near-term and far-ranging implications. Policy is a very interesting and important topic that determines what space development will look like in the next few years as well as the next 100 years. So we have split this interview up into 2 parts. Please join us for part 2 as we dive deeper into the Beyond Earth Symposium that is happening in November. Today, we talk with Steve Wolfe, President and co-founder of Beyond Earth Institute. And I would like to note some transparency. Steve and I work together at Global Spaceport Alliance and in the GSA Spaceport Summit that's happening in January 29th of 2024. So please join us then. So welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Very good, Izzy. How are you? Pleasure to be here.
Oh, pleasure to have you here. When I do the podcast, I like to start off with getting to know you a little bit better and learning about how your journey began. So how did you get involved in space?
Oh, that's a good one. I love that first question because, I'm certainly one of those folks that have my interest in space really goes back to when I was a teenager. And I think the first time I became very maybe you would say emotionally connected to space was not necessarily the Apollo program. So I was old enough to see the Apollo lunar landing in 1969, which was exciting. Everyone at the time was just crazy about that. But what really got me was a few years after that. It really was not that long after that the Apollo program was canceled.
Yeah.
And we decided that we were going to stop going to the moon. And that's when I sort of first kind of woke up to say, wait a minute, I thought I was living in a world where humankind was traveling to other planetary surfaces and doing experiments, and that was going to just kind of continue into my adulthood. And suddenly we're not doing it anymore, and so that kind of was the first sort of tumbler that went off in my mind. And then it was a few years after that, I was still a teenager, that I was exposed to the work of Gerard K. O'Neill, right? So I don't know if you imagine you're from, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with Gerard K. O'Neill. He wrote a pivotal book called The High Frontier. And in this book, he articulated in somewhat great detail how human civilization might expand into space and live in very large floating habitats that rotate to create artificial gravity, and that ultimately could sustain 10,000, a population of 10,000 or more. And so, and it was this sort of view of a very positive future that sort of it really grabbed me at the time. And it only has evolved over the years, and it provided an impetus for me as I delved into this, an impetus for me as I went to college. I created the first I created a society, helped to create a society. Some people might remember the old L5 Society. So that was sort of an advocacy group at the time, one of the first space advocacy groups. And we had meetings in college, and I helped to put together slide decks, and that we went to the local, went to RPI, Rensselaer Polytech, by the way. And we took this slide deck around to area high schools and grammar schools and told them about this amazing vision of the future, that kind of thing. So we're very interested, even then, interested in STEM and getting kids excited about the space vision. As a young professional, I found my way to Capitol Hill and went to work for a venerable Congressman, George E. Brown Jr., who for a time was the chairman of the Science and Technology Committee. And I was his space policy staff person. Sort of worked my way into that, and managed the space agenda. He was unique in that he was very pro space science, unmanned space science, deep space probes, and he was very pro human access to space. At the time, there was the shuttle had just started operations, so it was an exciting time during that period. I was there during the time of the shuttle, the Challenger disaster. That was a very difficult time. And it was also a time that we were trying to get our act together with regard to the International Space Station, which was interesting, kind of where we are now with that. One thing that I was able to do while I was on the Hill was when Congressman George Brown challenged me, and he challenged other staffers there, to give him recommendations for legislative action that he could take. 1988 was the start of a new Congress. And as he typically did, he wanted his staff to think big, to think bold, and give him ideas for moving forward. You know, he's very much was, interestingly, he was a strong environmentalist. He was actually a strong animal rights advocate, but he was also a very strong space advocate. So he sort of was this very interesting individual, was very interested in alternative energy sources. And that was also in my portfolio as well. I had been kept in the back of my mind the O'Neill ideas. I had linked up with like-minded individuals around Washington. Some of them very highly placed in the White House and in Congress, who were supportive of these long-term vision ideas. The National Commission on Space had just released a report in 1987, which, among other things, recommended that there be established a goal of establishing communities beyond Earth, or space settlements. And there were a few other things that sort of made me think, well, you know what, maybe it is time for this. So I, with my congressman's encouragement, I drafted a bill called the Space Settlement Act of 1988, which would have amended the original NASA Act to essentially state that all of our activities in space were leading logically towards the settlement of space. Then this progression was a very good thing and in the common good of the United States. And then further required NASA, it was a reporting requirement that said that NASA needed to report our progression towards creating the space settlements every 2 years. This report needed to be reported. And there was a series of some 10 to 12 items upon which they needed to report. Some of them had to do with the scientific, the technology development, where were the technology gaps? How are we going to engage the commercial sector or the private sector in moving towards this? So in many ways, it was very much, people told me at the time that we were very much ahead of our time in that legislation. To wrap up this part of the story, that legislation ultimately was incorporated into the NASA Authorization Bill of 1988. So it really was the first time that the term space settlement was incorporated into public law. The space advocacy community, as you can imagine, was very excited about that. Some of the more traditional folks around Washington in the space arena were not as excited about it. So it was an interesting period that followed. But I think ultimately, what I like to say then, I think we were ahead of our time and ahead of our thinking. But now with the Beyond Earth Institute, we largely founded that because not only do we feel that we're not ahead of our time, but we actually may be behind the curve, given so much advancement that's rapidly taking place. It kind of bookends my personal career, my personal journey, and coming back around and really focusing again on this particular mission.
Well, in a lot of respects, we should have already been there. It was 60 years ago, that this was all happening. So I think 1973 was the last moon landing. Does that sound about right? So yeah. That was a long time ago, and we should have been back by now, and we should have had a settlement. And so yeah, I agree. We're behind, and the rate at which things are changing in the space industry is just it's an exciting time to be in it, for sure. Tell us a little bit about what Beyond Earth Institute, why'd you start it? How'd you start it? When did you start it? And what did they do? So tell us a little bit about it.
The genesis of this, it was something that I started thinking about. I probably had it in the back of my mind over 10 years, just sort of noodling, what would be an appropriate method or organization that could help to really move us towards a space. And we're changing the terminology. We're saying communities beyond Earth, because as we well know, terms like colony and settlement are charged terms. So we'll use communities beyond Earth. Well, we're looking at different ways in which an organization of some sort of action might help to move this process forward. In order for us to get into space, in order for us to succeed with space settlement, there were three pillars that we had to get right. One of those pillars is the technology, right? So any kind of action you could do to advance the technology would be important, right? There's still a lot of development in that way that we need to do. There's no question about that, as exciting as our times are. The other side is the financing. How do we, no buck Rogers, no bucks, no buck Rogers. And how do you manage that, especially as you talk larger and larger facilities or infrastructure elements? So right now, there's a lot of excitement around how much money is being invested into the space arena, although there's been a little bit of slowdown because of the economy. There's the appetite for investing in space is very strong. So because people are looking at space not just as exploration or a science thing, they're looking at this as an economic driver. So there's that piece of it. But then there's another piece, which is the policy piece or the regulatory piece, that governments can and do have a strong influence over what happens both in the financial arena and the technology development arena. A lot of this comes through NASA, but there's other ways of incentivizing the private sector and so forth. To sort of float this idea of focusing my attention on the policy side, in 2019, I organized a one-day symposium as a pre-event for the ISDC. The National Space Society had their meeting in Washington, and I organized a one-day event under their sort of umbrella, just to see what the appetite was for this. And so we basically had this sold-out event, pre-conference. People came in, from all over. And we attracted some really impressive people, came out, a great roster of speakers, including former Congressman Bob Walker. Just folks are very eager. The appetite for this was just tremendous. And so out of that, there was a cohort of us formed and said, okay, how do we carry this forward? And that was sort of the genesis of the Beyond Earth Institute. For 6 months or so, we had conversation, and then ultimately we started just dipping our toe in the water with some webinars and so forth. And it was extremely well received. And then of course COVID hit, so it really was just virtual for the COVID years. And then we came out last year, 2022. We felt that we were ready. We had our first in-person symposium, and we held it at University of Arizona facilities in Washington, D.C., which was very well attended. We sort of grew out of the space that they had available. They have very nice spaces, but they were, we were able to hold only like 100 plus maximum. We outgrew that. And this year, just a little over a month, about 5 weeks from now, November 1st and 2nd, we are going to host our second Beyond Earth Symposium. That's going to be at American University, their Washington School of Law. We are certainly encouraging people who are interested in this topic area. Certainly, and I don't know if you're able to post the website for that, but it's simply beyondearthsymposium.org. All the information about the event. That's sort of the structural genesis. And then we could get into sort of what is our agenda. What are the things we're actually trying to work on? What are we trying to do as an organization?
Hold on to your boosters. We will be right back with guest Steve Wolfe with Beyond Earth Institute after a brief message from our sponsors. Please like and subscribe to the Space Marketing Podcast wherever you listen. Tell us a little bit more about what the goal of the symposium is.
The symposium, obviously is a reflection of the legislative, or I should say the policy priorities of the organization. Obviously policy does translate into specific legislative action and so forth. But as you mentioned initially, we are a think tank. So we're not a lobbying group, and we're not an advocacy group as such. So we prefer to provide the content underpinning and rationale, if you will, that folks would take to help to sell their case on the Hill. We are having informational meetings on the Hill and so forth, which is very important. We have sort of generally speaking, we have two approaches to the policy activities that we engage in. On the one side, we're looking at all of the immediate space policy issues that Congress and the administration are facing. And we look at that through the lens of establishing communities beyond Earth. So therefore, how will this help us to advance this long-term vision, right? So, and then secondly is looking at being sort of a trailblazer, if you will, sort of asking bigger questions that might not be as immediate. Maybe the Washington insiders aren't huddled around trying to solve these issues, but they are important nonetheless, and should be, even though if they're not on the front burner, hopefully they will become on the front burner. So, so the front burner issues right now, one of our primary ones is the NASA's Commercial LEO Destination Program. For those of you not familiar, NASA and through the administration, frankly, through space policy directives, has said that NASA needs to leave LEO because it's somewhat of a known and is established as something that's ready to sort of pass off to the private sector, right? So the ISS is now scheduled to retire in that regard. And with NASA saying that, okay, with the funds that we are going to save by not having a space station, we're now going to put that into deep space exploration. Because ultimately, that's more of the mission of NASA. NASA is a science and exploration entity. They are not a commercial entity. The one good thing, though, that's happened recently is NASA has been working much better with the private sector to enable and to enhance the ability of the private sector to do more and to leverage the investment community. The biggest case in point is what happened with SpaceX and how SpaceX was able to grow and evolve, because NASA told them, we want to get to the space station with people and cargo. We don't care how you do it. Just come up with a rocket that'll get us there. We'll approve the rocket, but we're not going to tell you exactly how to build it. And that created this opportunity for creativity, allowed Elon Musk to go back to the very, very, very basics of rocketry and build up something brand new that had never been known before. Of course, he settled on the Falcon 9 and the Raptor engines, and sort of the rest is sort of history, right? And he's still making history daily, and we're anticipating the Starship and so forth. So space station is due to retire in 2030, by the end of this decade. Now, some people say, well, it's probably not going to retire then. It'll probably get extended another few years, but it's going to retire, whether it's 2030, 2035. Its life cycle is coming to an end. That's going to free up money. However, NASA still has a need for conducting experiments in LEO. That need is not going to go away. So the idea is to encourage the creation of commercial space stations in low Earth orbit, kind of what they did with the Falcon, the development of the Falcon. We'll seed you some money to 4 competitors, if you include Axiom, and who are coming up with plans and got some money, but all of these companies now have to find their own investment money to add to what NASA is giving them. NASA is going to guarantee a certain amount of experimentation on those facilities, but these facilities are now bound to find new customers, additional customer bases. So this creating the potential for really exciting future for human activity in low Earth orbit. However, there's so many challenges, right? That's why I wrote this an op-ed in Space News in June, in their June magazine, where I argued that the CLD program must not fail, right? Because as exciting as the CLD program is, there's so many pitfalls ahead for so many challenges ahead. Some of them are straight up, markets. Is the market there? That's a big challenge, because private interests have to come up and have to want to go up to the space station or whatever. All the folks are working on these markets and developing them, and there's a lot of big potential there. They do need the continued funding and support from NASA over time until these things are fully operational. They need those guarantees for NASA to fly on these facilities. There's a big uncertainty of that. NASA, unfortunately, like every other agency, is subject to budget problems. Significant cuts will have to be made across the board, and every agency will have to find these cuts somewhere. That puts all programs, including the CLD program, in jeopardy. There's huge challenges there. I think what we're trying to do is elevate this conversation about the CLDs, about these companies, Voyager, Blue Origin, the so-called Orbital Reef Group, which is Blue Origin and Sierra Space, and then of course Northrop Grumman Corporation, and then of course Axiom. Those are the 4 big ones that are building out and developing these habitats. It's very exciting to see their artistic renditions, and then there are other entrants into this market as well. So even though they're not getting direct space NASA dollars, although some of them eventually will or will indirectly get NASA dollars. So you have a company like Gravitix that's building the habitat framework, that anybody could buy. They want to be the Boeing of space. Here's the habitat with the power and life support system on board. You could trick it out with however you want, right? And we have another similar thing, a new entrant called VAST. And this was a company that similarly, they're building large habitats. It's a group of people formerly from SpaceX. So they're using the same life support system largely that the Dragon uses. And there are other entrants too. So it's an exciting moment for commercial space habitats. We want this trajectory to keep going up. We want to do whatever we could do to keep it from sort of dampening, because we've seen this in other points in the development of commercial sector where there seems to be so much interest. Maybe it's largely in the launch sector, where we were excited, and then all of a sudden it didn't quite. They ran out of money. The technology, they couldn't quite work out, the markets and so forth. So that's a challenge, and as a think tank, obviously we're supporting that through policy recommendations. That's one big area. And then more the sort of nuts and bolts issues that are going on right now. This issue of something called mission authorization. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty talks about how nation states are responsible for their private actors in space. Mission authorization is sort of transitioning there are challenges because there are new and novel activities in space. Certainly the human element in space is coming up, which we really haven't, is something completely new. Creates all sorts of novel questions and challenges because it's not wholly government owned and controlled, but the government still has to have oversight of that. And so, and that goes for other types of technology that have to do with in-space servicing, in-space manufacturing. You hear a lot about in lunar or cislunar operations. There's going to be, over the next decade, there are 100 missions going to the moon. Many of those are private, and they are conducting a variety of different experiments. Some of them are prospecting, looking for what are the resources. They are assessing those. We're getting back there with the Artemis program. According to NASA, we're going there to stay, right? That's our stated policy. We're going to go there. We're going to set up the lunar base camp.
And if we don't, other countries are going to, because India just landed on the moon.
India just landed on the moon. They have a rover in the South Pole. That's a first for them. They're very aggressive. Now, whether they have the means, the wherewithal in terms of the deep pockets in order to man very large operations, that's a question mark. But then again, they are very eager. I'm sort of going deeply into some of these topics. So what are the continuing roles and responsibilities within NASA agencies? FAA has certain responsibilities. Department of Commerce is really emerging as a more important player in all of this. And to what extent should they have responsibility for in-space activities? It's a challenging time. We're contributing insights and recommendations as we go. And I think all of these could kind of come back to the conference, the Beyond Earth conference, if I may. And I appreciate your allowing me to have this platform and get into some of this, because I think all of these things play into the symposium. And you mentioned India. The very first part of the program is going to be international. We're going to have a representative from India, Kruni Joshi, for example. He is the Science Council of India. He's going to be joining us, and we're going to be very interested to hear what he has to say. It'll be international. We're looking to bring in participation from Europe, Japan, and then the Netherlands. The Hague Institute for Global Justice is the leader in something called the Washington Compact. Folks may be familiar with the Artemis Accords, which is an agreement among like-minded nations on a set of principles on how we're going to behave in space. The Washington Compact is a related set of principles amongst private actors that they agree to behave in space. So it's sort of the Artemis Accords for the private sector. Yeah, so their representation will be on this thing. So we want to start out with an international flavor. The conference is a day and a half, by the way. So it starts at about 1:30 on the 1st of November. And so we'll open it with an international conversation. And then in the second half of that day, we'll have a big question that will say, how do we make the case for communities beyond Earth?
Don't go anywhere. Policy is very important. It determines how space will look in the next few years and the next 100 years. So stay tuned for part 2 as we dive deeper into the Beyond Earth Symposium that is happening in November.